In the heart of Rome, a city built upon layers of empire, faith, and myth, stands a sovereign state unlike any other on earth. The Vatican City, the spiritual and administrative center of the Roman Catholic Church, has for 2 millennia been the custodian of the world's largest Christian congregation. It is a realm of profound public faith, of ancient rituals conducted in the full light of day, and of teachings that have shaped the moral and spiritual landscape of entire civilizations. Its towering basilica, its revered art, and its public pronouncements present a face of unwavering certainty, a rock of ages standing firm against the shifting tides of human history. Yet, like any ancient and powerful institution, the Vatican is also a place of secrets. Its immense archives, spanning countless miles of shelving, are said to contain not only the documented history of the Church, but also knowledge considered too dangerous, too destabilizing, or too inexplicable for public consumption. It is within these hidden vaults, shielded from the eyes of the world, that a different kind of history is preserved, a history that challenges the very foundations of our understanding. This narrative ventures into the shadowy intersection of faith, ancient mythology, and a terrifying alternative history. It proposes a startling idea, that deep within the Vatican's most guarded chambers, among the scrolls and codices deemed secretum or Magrantha ultimate secret, lies a fear that predates the concept of Satan himself, a primordial dread that makes the devil in a sense seem almost familiar. This fear is not born of divine prophecy or spiritual revelation, but of something the Church's most clandestine scholars believe to be a tangible, historical, and existential threat. It is a fear rooted in the clay tablets of a civilization long turned to dust, in the myths of a people who first put stylus to wet earth to record the stories of their gods. This is the fear of the Anunnaki. To understand the weight of this claim, we must first step back from the hallowed halls of the Vatican and journey to the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the cradle of civilization itself. It was here, in ancient Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, that humanity first began to build cities, to develop complex systems of writing, law, and astronomy. And it was here that their most foundational stories were inscribed in cuneiform script upon clay tablets. These were not mere fables. To the Sumerians, they were their history, their cosmology, their truth. Central to this truth were the Anunnaki, a pantheon of deities whose name is often translated as those who, from heaven to earth, came. The Sumerian texts, such as the famed Epic of Creation, the Enuma Elish, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, describe the Anunnaki not as abstract spiritual forces, but as powerful, physical beings. They were depicted as towering figures, possessing advanced knowledge and technology far beyond human comprehension. They could travel between the stars, they manipulated the very fabric of life, and they wielded power that could shape continents. According to these ancient accounts, the Anunnaki came to Earth from a planet they called Nibiru, a mysterious member of our own solar system on a long elliptical orbit. Their initial purpose was to extract precious resources, primarily gold, needed to stabilize the atmosphere of their homeworld. The labor, however, was immense, and it led to a moment of cataclysmic intervention. The Sumerian creation myth, particularly detailed in the Atreus' epic, tells of a rebellion among the Anunnaki workers. Tired of their toil, they demanded a solution. In response, the chief scientists among them, Enki and his half-sister Ninhursag, proposed a radical solution: to create a primitive worker, a Lulu, to take over the labor. Using genetic manipulation, they combined the essence of a young Anunnaki with the existing hominid species on Earth, Homo erectus. The result was Homo sapiens, us. We were, according to this narrative, engineered as a slave species, a hybrid creation meant to serve our celestial masters. The gods had made man in their own image, but not as an act of divine love, rather as an act of industrial necessity. This origin story stands in stark, shocking contrast to the book of Genesis, where Genesis speaks of a singular, omnipotent God creating humanity out of love and with a divine purpose. The Sumerian tablets speak of a council of gods creating humanity out of need and for servitude. One story is spiritual and metaphysical. The other reads almost like a technical manual, an account of genetic engineering. For centuries, these two narratives existed in separate silos, one the bedrock of Western faith, the other a curious, largely ignored footnote of archaeology. But what if the Church, in its relentless pursuit of all knowledge, both sacred and heretical, discovered that these two stories were not separate at all. What if they found evidence that the Sumerian account was not myth, but a distorted memory of a real pre-Adamic history? This is the core of the profound and terrifying dilemma we will explore. The devil, Lucifer, Satan, this figure, is an integral part of the Christian cosmological framework. He is the adversary, the tempter, the fallen angel, but he is a known quantity. His role is defined within the context of God's creation. He is part of the divine plan, a necessary opposition in the grand struggle between good and evil. His existence, however frightening, ultimately reaffirms the sovereignty of God. The Church has developed two millennia of theology, exorcism rites, and spiritual warfare strategies to contend with this diabolical threat. The devil is, in a theological sense, manageable, but the Anunnaki, should their story be true, represent something entirely different and far more dangerous. They are not fallen angels operating within a spiritual realm. They are physical, technological beings from another world, whose actions predate the Adam and Eve story. Their existence would not challenge the Church's doctrine. It would shatter its very historical foundation. It would mean that humanity was not uniquely created by a loving God in a pristine garden, but was genetically engineered by alien beings for a mundane purpose. It would relocate the story of human origins from the realm of divine mystery to the realm of cosmic science. The Garden of Eden could be reinterpreted as a laboratory, the Tree of Knowledge as a metaphor for genetic enlightenment, or the granting of higher consciousness by a rebellious Anunnaki like Enki, and the fall not as a sin, but as an intentional act of liberation by our creators. This is the fear that is said to haunt the deepest chambers of the Vatican. It is not a fear of a spiritual enemy, but a fear of historical and theological obsolescence. The devil can be fought with prayer and holy water. How does one fight a paradigm shift? How does an institution built on the inerrancy of a sacred text respond to evidence that the text itself might be a later, divinely inspired but fundamentally human reinterpretation of a much older, more terrifying truth? The fear of the Anunnaki is the fear that the Genesis story is not the first chapter of human history, but a divinely-sanctioned cover story for a far more unsettling origin. The Church has perhaps known about for centuries and has fought to keep buried, not out of malice, but out of a perceived duty to protect humanity from a truth it is not ready to face. This is the secret that begins our story, a secret not of hellfire and brimstone, but of ancient astronauts and a forgotten Genesis. The journey from the sun-drenched piazzas of Rome to the silent, subterranean depths of the Vatican's secret archives is a descent through layers of time, faith, and secrecy. The archives are not a single room but a vast, labyrinthine complex, a fortified city of knowledge stretching over 50 miles of shelving, housing manuscripts and documents that span a millennium. It is a place where history is not merely recorded but curated, and in some cases, concealed. Access is a privilege granted to a select few scholars, and even then, their inquiries are meticulously monitored. The most sensitive materials, those bearing the classifications Secretum, Vaticanum, or the dreaded Archivum Secretum, Apostolicum, are forever beyond their reach. It is within this inner sanctum of restricted knowledge that the Church's most troubling secrets are said to reside. The origins of the Vatican's alleged awareness of the Anunnaki narrative are not found in a single dramatic discovery but in a slow, creeping accumulation of heretical knowledge pieced together over centuries from the most unlikely of sources. The story begins not with archaeologists, but with inquisitors, diplomats, and spies of the Church, men whose duty was to seek out and neutralize threats to the faith. From the earliest days of the Church's temporal power, its agents were scattered across the known world, and later, the New World, gathering intelligence on heretical movements, pagan beliefs, and any ideology that could undermine its doctrine. The first inklings emerged from the deserts of Mesopotamia itself. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as the Church expanded its missionary efforts into the Ottoman Empire, Jesuit and Dominican scholars encountered the few remaining indigenous communities, who still held onto fragments of ancient oral traditions. These stories, spoken in hushed tones, spoke of the star gods who descended in fiery chariots, of a time before the Great Flood, when giants walked the earth and shaped mankind from clay and blood. The missionaries, trained to identify and dismiss pagan idolatry, initially dismissed these tales as demonic folklore. the work of the devil to lead souls astray with false creation myths. They dutifully recorded them as curiosities, as examples of the superstitions they were there to eradicate, and sent their reports back to Rome. Yet as more reports filtered in from different isolated cultures, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the high Andes of South America, from the ancient texts of India to the oral histories of remote African tribes, disturbing pattern began to emerge for those with the access and the inclination to see it. The specifics of the names and places changed, but the core narrative remained hauntingly consistent. Beings from the stars, a creation or intervention event, a great flood sent to wipe the slate clean, and a promise or a threat of return. These were not the scattered, random myths of unconnected peoples. They read like different chapters of the same global event, a cataclysm of Genesis remembered in fragments. The real turning point, however, came with the dawn of modern archaeology in the 19th century, as European explorers began to excavate the great mounds of the Middle East, unearthing the lost cities of Nineveh, Ur, and Babylon. They made a series of staggering discoveries. The libraries of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh yielded thousands of clay tablets, perfectly preserved by the fire that destroyed the city. Among them were the now famous epics, the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Atrahasis. For the first time, the sophisticated and complex cosmology of the Sumerians was laid bare for modern scholars to decipher. The news of these discoveries sent shockwaves through the academic world, but it sent a tremor of profound anxiety through certain corridors of the Vatican. Here was not the simple, primitive folklore the missionaries had described. This was a highly advanced, detailed, and coherent account of creation, a cosmology that predated the writings of Moses by over 1,000 years. The parallels to Genesis were undeniable and deeply troubling. Both spoke of a primeval universe of water and darkness. Both described a separation of the waters to create the firmament. Both featured a divine council. Most stunningly, the Epic of Gilgamesh contained a flood story with a Noah-like figure, Utnapishtim, who was instructed by a god to build a boat to save the seeds of life from a world-engulfing deluge. For the Church, which had long held the Mosaic texts to be the oldest and the original divine revelation, this was a direct challenge. The theological implication was seismic. If the Genesis story was not unique, but shared core elements with a much older pagan text, what did that say about its divine origin? The standard apologetic response was to argue that the Genesis account was the pristine, revealed truth, and the Sumerian version was a corrupted, demonically inspired memory of the same event. But a more frightening hypothesis began to take shape among a small, secretive cadre within the Church's highest intellectual echelons. What if the Sumerian account was the original? What if Genesis was not the source, but a later, monotheistic adaptation of a far older polytheistic tradition? This hypothesis transformed the Vatican's interest from academic curiosity into a matter of existential urgency. The Church could not afford to let this knowledge proliferate unchecked. A quiet, clandestine operation began. Vatican agents, often posing as scholars or benefactors, were dispatched to major archaeological digs, particularly those in Mesopotamia. Their mission was not to hinder the science, but to acquire, to document, and to control. They sought first editions of translations, the original tablets whenever possible, and most importantly, any tablets or fragments that seemed too unusual, too advanced, or too explicitly detailed to be released to the public. Whispers speak of a particular collection, a set of tablets that were never published in mainstream academic journals, that were acquired by the Church under circumstances shrouded in mystery. These tablets, allegedly, did not just speak of gods in metaphorical terms. They contained what appeared to be technical data, descriptions of celestial mechanics regarding the planet Nibiru, details of genetic procedures that used a life essence, and clay, and lists of minerals and their advanced applications. They spoke of wars among the gods that used weapons of unimaginable power, descriptions that to a modern reader would sound eerily like nuclear or energy-based artillery. They even hinted at a schism among the Anunnaki themselves, a conflict between those who viewed humanity as mere cattle, and those, like the rebellious Prometheus-like figure of Enki, who sought to grant us knowledge and autonomy. This was no longer just a competing creation myth. If true, this was a historical record, and it was a record that placed the origins of humanity in a context so alien, so technological, that it rendered the book of Genesis a beautiful, simplified allegory. The devil, in this context, became almost a comforting concept. He was a spiritual adversary within a system that affirmed the existence of the soul, divine judgment, and redemption. The Anunnaki, however, represented a threat of a different magnitude altogether. They were the architects of a materialistic origin story that left no room for the soul. They suggested that humanity's yearning for the divine was not a call from God, but perhaps a genetic memory of our creators, a programmed instinct to worship our makers. This was the knowledge that was deemed too dangerous. This was the fear that took root. It was not a fear of a battle for souls, but a fear of a nullification of the soul's very meaning. The archivists and prelates charged with guarding this secret believed they were not hiding the truth from humanity, but protecting humanity from a truth that could unravel the very fabric of human purpose, faith, and identity. They had contained the knowledge of the Anunnaki within the vaults, hoping it would remain a forgotten heresy. But the 20th century was coming, and with it, new discoveries and new theories would threaten to blow the doors off those ancient vaults forever. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a wave of technological and intellectual revolution that threatened to breach the very walls the Vatican had so carefully constructed around its most dangerous secret. The world was shrinking, information was flowing faster, and the field of archaeology was becoming more systematic and widespread. The Church, as quiet acquisition of troublesome artifacts and texts, became increasingly difficult as national governments established stricter controls over their cultural heritage, and as independent, secular institutions took the lead in excavation and interpretation. The secret of the Anunnaki, once confined to clay tablets in a dead language, was beginning to find new voices, new interpreters, and a vast, global audience. The most significant challenge emerged not from a dig site, but from the mind of a single, relentless man, Zecharia Sitchin, born in Azerbaijan and raised in Palestine. Sitchin was a linguist and journalist who possessed a formidable command of ancient languages, including Sumerian cuneiform. In the 1970s, he began publishing a series of books that would fundamentally reshape the public discourse on ancient astronauts and, from the Vatican's perspective, become a direct and alarming threat. His life's work, beginning with the 12th planet, was a detailed, controversial, and breathtakingly comprehensive synthesis of the Sumerian texts. Sitchin did not see them as mythology. He interpreted them as literal, journalistic accounts of Earth's history. Sitchin's thesis was a precise and terrifying echo of the very interpretations the Vatican had feared for centuries. He meticulously pieced together the celestial mechanics of Nibiru, its 3,600-year orbit, and the cataclysmic effects of its passage through our inner solar system. He described the Anunnaki not as metaphysical gods, but as astronauts from a technologically advanced civilization, the Nephilim of the Bible, who genetically engineered Homo sapiens as a slave race. He translated texts not as poetry, but as technical manuals, describing spaceships, orbital platforms, and advanced medical procedures. For Sitchin, the Garden of Eden was a biological laboratory, the Tower of Babel, a launch tower, and the Great Flood, a natural consequence of Nibiru's gravitational pull, causing the Antarctic ice sheet to slip into the ocean. To the academic establishment, Sitchin was a pariah, a pseudo-scholar guilty of gross mistranslation and wild speculation. His work was dismissed and ridiculed. But from the perspective of the Vatican's inner circle, he was something far more dangerous, a compelling heretic. He was taking the very same texts they had locked away and broadcasting his interpretation to millions of readers worldwide. He was connecting dots the Church had spent centuries keeping separate. He was providing a scientific, materialistic framework for human origins that was captivating, coherent, and for many, more believable than the Genesis account or the random chance of Darwinian evolution. The Church could not engage him publicly. To debate Sitchin would be to lend credibility to his ideas and to admit that the Sumerian texts were a legitimate counter-narrative to Genesis, a door the Vatican had vowed never to open. Instead, a new, more subtle strategy of containment was implemented. Vatican-appointed scholars and sympathetic Catholic academics were encouraged to publish forceful technical rebuttals, focusing on Sitchin's alleged linguistic errors and his rejection of mainstream archaeological consensus. The goal was to marginalize him within the academic community, to paint him as a fringe theorist, thus allowing the public to dismiss his work without the Church ever having to address its terrifying core premise. But Sitchin was not operating in a vacuum. His work coincided with, and fed into, a broader cultural phenomenon. The rise of the ancient astronaut theory, popularized by figures like Erich von Däniken. Suddenly, ancient monuments like the pyramids of Giza, Stonehenge, and the Nazca Lines were being re-examined through a lens of extraterrestrial intervention. This global movement created a cultural firewall for the Vatican. They could now lump Sitchin's specific, text-based scholarship in with more sensationalized and less rigorous claims about alien visitations. By allowing the entire genre to be branded as entertainment for the gullible, the Church could protect the specific secret of the Anunnaki within a cloud of general ridicule. However, the 20th century provided another, even more profound challenge: the space age. For millennia, the heavens were the domain of gods and angels, a metaphysical realm beyond human reach. Now, humanity was building machines to touch it. As rockets pierced the atmosphere and probes were sent to other planets, a new, terrifying question arose within the Vatican's secret councils. What if we find them? Or worse, what if they find us? The possibility of extraterrestrial life had been a theological debate for centuries, but now it was a practical, imminent reality. The discovery of even simple microbial life on Mars would force a radical rethinking of humanity's special place in creation. But the discovery of intelligent life, or evidence of past visitation, would be catastrophic. It would vindicate Sitchin and the Sumerian texts entirely. The internal discussions were fraught with anxiety. Could the existence of alien life be reconciled with Catholic doctrine? Perhaps. But could the existence of the Anunnaki beings, who claimed to have created Us, be reconciled? It would represent the greatest theological crisis since the Reformation. The fear was no longer just about the past. It was about the future. The Sumerian texts were not just a record of the past. They were prophetic. They spoke of the eventual return of Nibiru and the renewal of the Anunnaki's claim over their creation, humanity. This introduced an apocalyptic dimension to the threat that made the devil's machinations seem almost petty. Satan sought the corruption of souls. The Anunnaki, according to the texts, sought the reclamation of property. The Book of Revelation spoke of a final battle between the forces of Christ and the forces of Antichrist. But what if the great deception was not spiritual, but historical? What if the false god that humanity would be tempted to worship was not a metaphysical demon, but a very physical, technologically superior creator race returning to claim its due? This cosmic question forced a silent, secret schism within the Church's highest levels. One faction, the traditionalists, argued for continued suppression. Any acknowledgement was a Pandora's box that could never be closed. Another, more pragmatic faction, began to argue for a slow, controlled acclimatization of the faithful. They pointed to the statements of respected theologians and even astronomers like Monsignor Corrado Balducci, who, with Vatican approval, had publicly discussed the possibility of extraterrestrial life and stated it would not contradict faith. This, they argued, was the first step in a necessary, gradual preparation away to expand the theological framework to accommodate a shattering truth without completely destroying it. The strategy became one of managed disclosure. The focus would be on the possibility of simple, alien life, a concept that could be framed as a celebration of God's infinite creative power. The more terrifying concept of creator beings of the Anunnaki would remain locked away, the Church's most guarded secret. The devil was a known enemy within the walls. The Anunnaki were the besieging army outside, and the Vatican dared not even speak their name for fear that the walls themselves would hear and crumble. The silence was a defense, a prayer that the orbit of Nibiru was just a myth, and that the creators, if they ever existed, had forgotten about their experiment on Earth. But as the world raced toward a future of deeper space, exploration and genetic manipulation, the keepers of the secret knew that time was not on their side. The past they had buried was beginning to look ominously like the future. To fully grasp the profound and unique nature of the Vatican's alleged fear of the Anunnaki, one must first understand the Church's long and intricate relationship with its ultimate spiritual adversary, the devil. For 2 millennia, the figure of Satan has been the central antagonist in the Christian narrative, the embodiment of pure evil and rebellion against the divine order. Yet, within the complex theology of the Church, the devil is a known quantity, an entity whose nature, motivations, and limitations are clearly defined. He is, in a paradoxical sense, a manageable foe. The Church's doctrine on Satan is precise. He is not a rival god, but a created being, a fallen angel, Lucifer, whose sin was one of pride and a refusal to serve God and humanity. His fall from grace was not a defeat of God, but an affirmation of free will, a necessary consequence of a creation that includes the capacity for choice. This is a critical point. The devil exists within God's creation and is ultimately subject to God's sovereignty. His power, while formidable, is permitted by God and has strict limits. He is the tempter, the accuser, the father of lies, but he cannot read human thoughts. He cannot force a soul to sin, and his ultimate fate, eternal defeat and imprisonment in hell, is already prophesied in the book of Revelation. He is a defeated enemy, playing out the final acts of a war whose outcome is already decided. This theological framework provides the Church with a comprehensive and effective arsenal for spiritual warfare. The rites of exorcism, for instance, are not a magical duel with a dark god. They are a commanding invocation of the authority of Jesus Christ to rebuke and expel a rebellious spirit. The prayers, the holy water, the sacramentals, all of these are not weapons in their own right, but conduits of divine power, tools to fortify the faithful and remind the demonic of their subordinate status. The entire struggle is enacted on a spiritual battlefield, a realm of faith, morality, and the human soul. It is a battle for eternity, not for history. The fear Satan inspires is a fear of personal corruption and eternal damnation. It is an internal fear, a fear of moral failure, of succumbing to temptation, of losing one's soul. The Church offers a clear path to resist this fear, through faith, prayer, sacrament, and a righteous life. The narrative is one of constant vigilance and personal responsibility, but it is a narrative that ultimately reinforces the power of God and the efficacy of the Church as the conduit of His grace. The devil, for all his horror, reaffirms the system he seeks to destroy. Contrast this with the ontological threat posed by the Anunnaki hypothesis. The fear they represent is not spiritual, but historical and existential. If the Sumerian texts are a literal account, then the Anunnaki are physical beings who operate not through spiritual temptation, but through genetic engineering and technological manipulation. Their threat is not to the soul's eternity, but to the very story of the soul's origin. This creates a crisis that prayer cannot solve and holy water cannot repel. How does one exercise a historical fact? How does one combat a paradigm shift with a crucifix? The Anunnaki narrative does not confront the Church on the spiritual battlefield where it is strongest. It bypasses that battlefield entirely. It attacks the foundation of the story itself. It suggests that the Garden of Eden is not a metaphor for humanity as spiritual infancy, but a record of its biological manufacture. It implies that the image of God in which we are made is not a spiritual likeness, but a genetic one. It proposes that the yearning for a creator is not a divine calling, but an implanted instinct, a biological command to seek out our makers. This is why, within the secretive hypothesis we are exploring, the Vatican's fear of the Anunnaki is said to be so much greater. The devil is a rebel within the kingdom, a known insurgent whose tactics are familiar. The Anunnaki are the architects of the kingdom itself, who may return one day to inform the inhabitants that the kingdom's founding myth is a lie, that the king they worship is a placeholder, and that their true purpose is not salvation, but servitude. The devil offers the temptation of sin, which can be resisted and forgiven. The Anunnaki offer the revelation of meaninglessness, which could shatter the human spirit beyond repair. One threatens damnation, a concept that still operates within a framework of divine justice. The other threatens obsolescence, a void where the concepts of sin, salvation, and soul have no meaning at all. This fundamental difference explains the Church's vastly different approaches. The devil is fought openly. His existence is preached from the pulpit. His tactics are detailed in catechism, and his defeat is celebrated in liturgy. The Anunnaki, however, are silenced. Their story is not engaged with, not debated, not even acknowledged. It is buried, not because it is less real, but because it is considered more dangerous. It is a truth that, if accepted, would not create more faithful believers, but would instead create a profound spiritual vacuum, a crisis of purpose that the Church, in this view, believes it is its sacred duty to prevent. They fear the Anunnaki more because the devil can be cast out, but a rewritten history can never be unknown. The immense weight of the secret we are exploring could not rest on the shoulders of a single generation. The Church, an institution that measures its life in centuries, operates on a timescale far beyond that of individual popes or cardinals. The knowledge of the Anunnaki and the policy of its suppression would therefore have to be institutionalized, passed down through a clandestine lineage of guardians within the Church's most shadowy recesses. This chapter delves into the hypothetical mechanisms and the human cost of maintaining such a world-altering truth. The responsibility for this secret would not be found in any official organizational chart. It would not be the duty of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith alone, nor the Vatican's secret archives prefect, nor the Pope's personal staff. Instead, it is imagined to be the purview of a highly specialized, incredibly discreet, and informally constituted grouper custodian lineage operating within the deeper architecture of the Church's power structure. Some whispers and theories have given this imagined group a name: the Custodians of the Genesis Verity. Membership in such a group would not be sought. It would be bestowed, a mantle of immense burden passed from one generation to the next. Selection would be based on a combination of impeccable theological orthodoxy, unwavering loyalty to the institution, superior intellect, and a profound psychological stability necessary to bear the knowledge without breaking. They would often be drawn from the ranks of the Jesuit order, renowned for their scholarly rigor and intellectual discipline, or from the ancient and secretive diplomatic corps of the Holy See, masters of discretion and realpolitik. The initiation of a new custodian would be a solemn, terrifying event. It would involve a gradual unveiling, first through theoretical theological dilemmas about creation and extraterrestrial life, then through the study of carefully selected heretical texts, and finally, in a secured chamber deep within the archives, the presentation of the evidence itself, the translated cusps of the Sumerian tablets, the artifacts of unknown provenance, the reports from field agents over the centuries. The initiate would be forced to confront the horrifying possibility that the faith they had dedicated their life to was built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of human origins. Their task would not be to believe the alternative narrative, but to accept its terrifying plausibility and to dedicate their lives to ensuring it never shook the foundations of global faith. The tools of the custodians are as varied as they are subtle. Their primary weapon is acquisition. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, as explored earlier, this meant deploying agents to archaeological sites and private auctions. In the modern era, their methods would have evolved. It would involve monitoring the digital archives of universities and museums worldwide using cutting-edge technology to scour the dark web for leaks or new interpretations, and employing financial intermediaries to anonymously acquire potentially disruptive artifacts or documents before they enter the public domain. Their goal is not to destroy knowledge. The Church venerates knowledge, but to control its flow, to keep it contained within the academic fringe, where it can be safely dismissed. Another tool is influence. The custodians would cultivate relationships with key figures in archaeology, astronomy, genetics, and history. They would fund research that supports conventional timelines and interpretations, while subtly discouraging, through the denial of grants or academic prestige, lines of inquiry that venture too close to the forbidden territory. A well-placed word from a Vatican-backed scholar in a peer-reviewed journal can be more effective than 1,000 threats in silencing a radical theory. It is a strategy of gentle steering, of managing the consensus of what is considered acceptable scholarship. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this guardianship is the personal toll on the individuals involved. These are men of profound faith who have been forced to live with the cognitive dissonance of staggering proportions. They attend Mass, administer sacraments, and preach the gospel of Genesis, all while holding in their minds a secret that utterly contradicts its literal truth. They are the ultimate shepherds, protecting their flock from a wolf they can never describe, living a life of immense intellectual and spiritual isolation. Theirs is a sacrifice not of martyrdom, but of silencer, perpetual lonely vigil over a truth they believe would break the world. This leads to the ultimate, haunting justification for this centuries-long conspiracy of silence: the doctrine of protective custody. The custodians, in this narrative, do not see themselves as villains hiding the truth. They see themselves as the last line of defense for human meaning. Their belief is that humanity's spiritual development is a fragile process. The concept of a loving, omnipotent God who created humanity with a purposeful soul is, in their view, a necessary evolutionary step for our species. It provides a moral framework, a sense of purpose, and a comfort in the face of mortality. that is essential for social cohesion and ethical progress, to reveal that our Creator was not God, but a group of fallible, squabbling, technologically advanced aliens, who created us as a labor force, would be to pull the cornerstone from the arch of human civilization. It would not lead to a new, enlightened age. They fear it would lead to nihilism, despair, and societal collapse. The truth, in their eyes, is a fire too bright for human eyes to bear. Their sacred duty, therefore, is to stand between that fire and humanity, to shield us from a light that would not illuminate, but blind. They fear the Anunnaki, not because their return would mean the end of the Church's power, but because it would mean the end of human hope. The devil offers a struggle that affirms the value of the soul. The Anunnaki offer a revelation that negates the soul's very existence. For the guardians of the secret, the continued silence, the perpetuation of a beautiful, necessary myth, is the highest form of pastoral care. It is a lie told for the salvation of the world, a burden shouldered so that billions may continue to live in a universe filled with purpose and grace. The weight of that burden is the true measure of their fear. For centuries, the Vatican's hypothetical guardians could comfort themselves with one undeniable fact. The Anunnaki narrative was pure myth. It was a story written on clay tablets by a pre-scientific culture, describing technologies and biological processes that were, by any rational measure, impossible. The gap between the Sumerian descriptions and human scientific capability was a vast and comforting chasm. However, the late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen that chasm narrow at an alarming rate. What was once the realm of ancient fantasy is now the cutting edge of modern science, creating a convergence that would have been unimaginable to the custodians of 100 years ago, and transforming a theological problem into an imminent reality. The most profound convergence lies in the field of genetics. The Sumerian tablets, particularly the Atreus' epic, describe a process where the goddess Nin and the god Enki take the essence of a young Anunnaki, the tepu and the blood, and mix it with the clay, the earthly hominid, Homo erectus, to create the first humans. For millennia, this was a magical, alchemical recipe. Today, it reads like a startlingly prescient metaphor for genetic engineering. The discovery of DNA, the double helix blueprint of life, provided a scientific language for this ancient procedure. The essence of the Anunnaki donor could be interpreted as advanced alien DNA. The clay is the existing primate genome. The act of mixing is the precise splicing of genes to create a new hybrid species, Homo sapiens. The project to map the entire human genome, completed in 2003, yielded its own mysteries that echoed this ancient story. Scientists have identified vast stretches of so-called junk DNA, sequences that do not code for proteins and whose function remains largely unknown. Could some of this DNA be the signature of an ancient manipulation? Furthermore, the rapid and unexplained leap in human cognitive ability, creativity and self-awareness around 200,000 years ago, an event that baffles paleoanthropologists and is known as the Great Leap Forward, fits perfectly with the timeline of an external genetic intervention. Science has not proven the Sumerian account, but it has provided a plausible mechanism for it, erasing the line between miracle and technology. Simultaneously, our exploration of the solar system has begun to validate the Sumerian cosmological map. The Sumerians described a solar system with 12 bodies, the Sun not considered a planet, the Moon also not a planet, the 9 planets we know today, and a 12th large planet called Nibiru on a long elliptical orbit. When the tablets were translated, our science only recognized 6 planets. We now know of 8, plus Pluto and a multitude of other dwarf planets in the Kuiper Belt. The existence of a yet undiscovered large planetary body in the outer reaches of our solar system. Planet X is a serious topic of debate among astronomers. Calculations based on gravitational perturbations in the orbits of known objects suggest something massive is out there, while Nibiru is a planet with a 3,600-year orbit crossing Earth's path, remains highly speculative. The scientific pursuit of a hidden planet lends an unexpected credibility to the ancient charts. The Sumerians, who shouldn't have known about Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, described a solar system that modern science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. The third pillar of this convergence is technology. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki possessing capabilities that were pure magic until recently. They spoke of dirges that could soar through the skies and into space, of weapons that could level cities with a single blast, of devices that could see and hear across vast distances. We now call these airplanes, rockets, nuclear weapons, and satellites. The ancient descriptions of the Anunnaki Esprite stones and fire crystals used for power sound less like fantasy and more like a crude description of advanced energy systems, perhaps even nuclear reactors. The gap between their described technology and our own is still vast, but it is no longer a gap between magic and reality. It is a gap between more advanced technology and our own. It is a quantitative difference, not a qualitative one. For the imagined Vatican custodians, this scientific convergence is a nightmare scenario. Their strategy had always relied on the sheer implausibility of the Anunnaki narrative. They could dismiss Sitchin and others as cranks, because mainstream science dismissed them. But now, mainstream science is inadvertently building a bridge toward the very ideas they have sought to suppress. Every headline about gene editing technology like CRISPR-Cas9, which allows scientists to alter DNA with unprecedented precision, is a headline that makes the Sumerian creation story seem less like a myth and more like a historical report. Every astronomical conference discussing the possibility of Planet X gives mathematical weight to the legend of Nibiru. This creates an untenable position. The Church has long maintained a stance that faith and science are two different paths to the same truth, that they can coexist in harmony. But what happens when science begins to uncover a truth that directly contradicts the foundational historical truth of faith? The custodians can no longer rely on the blanket dismissal of pseudoscience. They must now watch in silent horror as legitimate. Mainstream scientific progress steadily dismantles the walls of implausibility that have protected their secret for so long. The fear is no longer just that someone will translate a tablet correctly. It's that a geneticist in a lab in Boston, or an astronomer at an observatory in Chile, will make a discovery that forces the entire world to ask the question the Vatican has dreaded for centuries: who truly made us? The answer, when it comes, may not be found in a dusty archive, but in a petri dish or through a telescope. And when it does, the 2-millennial-long vigil of silence will be over. As the walls between ancient myth and modern science continue to crumble, the hypothetical guardians within the Vatican would be forced to move beyond mere containment. The strategy of silence, effective for centuries, becomes a precarious gamble when faced with the accelerating pace of discovery. This new era would necessitate a shift from passive guardianship to active contingency planning, forcing the Church to confront a series of unthinkable dilemmas for which no catechism or council could possibly prepare them. The primary and most immediate question is one of response. What does the Church do if the existence of the Anunnaki, or a creator species matching their description, is irrefutably proven? Not through the interpretation of ancient texts, but through direct, empirical evidence. Imagine a scenario. A returning deep space probe brings back biological artifacts with DNA clearly related to, yet distinct from, our own. Or perhaps astronomers finally pinpoint Planet X, and spectral analysis reveals an atmosphere capable of supporting a technologically advanced civilization. The proof would not be arguable. It would be data. In such a cataclysmically transformative moment, the Church could not remain silent. To do so would be to instantly render itself obsolete, a relic clinging to a disproven story, while the world grapples with a new, shattering reality. The custodians would therefore be forced to develop a graduated response plan, a theological and public relations strategy for the end of history as we know it. The first stage of this plan would likely involve a monumental effort of reinterpretation. The Church is a master of hermeneutics, the art of interpretation. Faced with this new truth, it would attempt the greatest act of hermeneutical gymnastics in its history, to absorb the Anunnaki into its existing theology. This would not be an admission that Genesis was wrong, but that it was allegorical or written for a primitive understanding. Key questions would need to be addressed with breathtaking speed and care. Who were the Anunnaki in the divine plan? Could they be recast as powerful, created beings, angels, perhaps entrusted by God with the physical act of creation? Were they the US in "Let us make mankind in our image"? Genesis 1:26. This would demote them from God's two instruments of the one true God, preserving divine sovereignty while accounting for their physical intervention. What is the soul? If the body is a product of genetic engineering, the Church would need to fiercely assert that the soul is a separate, divine impartation from God. the imago Dei that makes us truly human. The Anunnaki may have crafted the vessel, but God provided the spark. This would become the new, non-negotiable core of faith. What of original sin? The fall of man could be reinterpreted not as disobedience in a garden, but as the moment our genetically engineered ancestors achieved a higher consciousness, a knowledge of good and evil granted by a rebellious Anunnaki like Enkion thus became morally accountable beings before God. This theological pivot would be aimed at one goal: to prevent a total collapse of meaning by framing the Anunnaki as part of God's mysterious and now revealed creative process. It would be a desperate bid to keep God at the center of the story. Beyond theology lies the practical dilemma of prophecy. The Sumerian texts are not just historical, they are eschatological. They speak of the return. The planet Nibiru on its vast orbit is destined to come back, and with it, the Anunnaki would presumably return to assess their ancient creation. This presents the Church with a crisis of identity that makes the arrival of proof seem simple. What if the Book of Revelation, the cornerstone of Christian end-times prophecy, was not about a spiritual battle at all, but a distorted premonition of a physical, historical event? The terrifying figure of the Antichrist, a world leader demanding worship, could be reinterpreted as a spokesman for the returning Anunnaki, a human puppet facilitating the reintegration of humanity into their cosmic empire. The great deception that leads many astray could be the seductive power of their advanced technology and the undeniable truth of our origins. The final battle of Armageddon might not be a spiritual war between angels and demons, but a literal, catastrophic war of independence, as a fractured humanity struggles against its creators for the right to its own soul and destiny. For the Vatican, this is the ultimate fear realized. Their entire eschatological framework, the hopeful promise of Christ's second coming and the final defeat of evil, could be hijacked and inverted by the return of the Anunnaki. They could arrive not as invaders, but as saviors, fulfilling the promised return of gods that is embedded in countless cultures. They would be the ultimate false prophets, and their proof would be written in our very DNA. This potential future forces the custodians into a position of nightmarish vigilance. They must not only guard the past but also scan the future, monitoring astronomical data, genetic research, and global geopolitical shifts for any sign that the prophecy is moving toward fulfillment. Theirs becomes a dual mission: to spiritually prepare the faithful for a revelation that could shake their faith to its core, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that the long-dreaded return might be imminent. The silence is no longer just about protecting a secret from the past. It is about buying time to prepare for an unimaginable future. The devil you know tempts you to sin. The Anunnaki you fear might return to claim their property. And the Church must decide if it will shepherd humanity toward worship or toward war. The custody of a secret of such magnitude is not merely an intellectual or administrative task. It is a profound spiritual and psychological burden. For the individuals within this imagined inner circle of the Vatican, the men dubbed the custodians, the knowledge they guard is a constant, silent companion that shapes their every prayer, their every sermon, and their very understanding of God. This chapter ventures into the personal, human dimension of this guardianship, exploring the internal conflict that defines their lives, a conflict between unwavering faith and terrifying knowledge. Each custodian, upon his initiation, undergoes a crisis of faith that would break a lesser individual. He is presented with evidence that suggests the foundational story of his religion, the story he has preached and defended his entire life, might be a divinely inspired allegory built upon a far more ancient and unsettling historical truth. He must reconcile the God of infinite love and purpose with the possibility of a creation event that was clinical, technological, and devoid of the spiritual romance of Genesis. This is not an academic exercise. It is a wrenching of the soul. The psychological mechanisms for coping are complex and varied. Some custodians likely embrace a form of radical dualism. They compartmentalize their knowledge into two separate boxes: the spiritual truth of the Church and the historical truth of the Anunnaki. They believe that God, in his omniscience, used the vehicle of this ancient, physical event to bring about his spiritual creation. The Anunnaki were the brush, but God was the painter. This allows them to continue their priestly duties with fervor, seeing the sacraments and scriptures as the means to transcend our potentially manufactured origins and connect with the true divine. For others, the burden is heavier. They may come to see the Church itself not as the vessel of absolute truth, but as the guardian of a necessary fiction. Their faith shifts from a belief in the literal truth of Scripture to a belief in the utility of the story for human flourishing. They become shepherds protecting their flock from a terrifying existential abyss. Every Mass they celebrate, every baptism they perform, is an act of defiance against a cold, mechanistic universe, an affirmation of meaning in the face of a potential truth that suggests there is none. This becomes a tragic, heroic faith, based on a love for humanity so deep that they willingly bear the cross of a lie to protect it from despair. This internal struggle is compounded by intense isolation. A custodian can never unburden himself. He cannot seek counsel in confession, for the priest hearing it would not be cleared for such a secret. He cannot discuss his doubts with his brother priests over a glass of wine. He lives behind an invisible wall, separated from the very flock he serves by a knowledge that would shatter their world. The loneliness is absolute. His only confidants are the other custodians, men who share the same hollowed-out look in their eyes during a quiet moment in the apostolic palace, a look that communicates a shared understanding of a weight too immense for words. This isolation breeds a unique form of piety. Their prayers are not for worldly things or even for personal salvation, but for strength. Strength to continue the charade, strength to withstand the gnawing doubt, strength to face the possibility that they might be wrong, and that they are perpetuating a great deception that is stifling human evolution. Their most fervent prayer might be the most paradoxical of all, that they are wrong, that the Sumerian texts are mere myths, and that the Genesis story is literal truth. They pray for the failure of their own life, work for the secret they guard to remain forever unproven. The weight of this knowledge also transforms their view of the world outside the Vatican walls. They watch humanity's scientific progress with a mixture of awe and dread. Every breakthrough in genetics is a step closer to humanity discovering its own engineered nature. Every new exoplanet discovered is a reminder that the cosmos is vast and likely inhabited. They see the popularity of ancient astronaut theories on television not as silly entertainment, but as a dangerous cultural conditioning, a priming of the public psyche for a revelation they are not ready to handle responsibly. This burden ultimately forges a different kind of priest. He is less a father confessor and more a soldier in a cosmic Cold War, stationed on the walls of reality itself. His battleground is not a physical one, but the noetic realm of human belief and meaning. His enemy is not a spiritual tempter, but a historical fact waiting to be uncovered. His weapon is silence, and his hope, his only solace, is that is sacrificed, the sacrifice of his own certainty. His own peace of mind will purchase more time for humanity to mature, to strengthen its spiritual core, so that if the day of revelation ever comes, we will not be defined by our origins, but by our choice to look beyond them to a higher God. They bear the weight so that billions may continue to live in lightness. It is a burden of love, but it is a love that condemns them to a perpetual, silent night of the soul. In the 21st century, the strategy of absolute silence is no longer tenable. Information, once controllable within the vaults of the Vatican and a handful of elite universities, now flows through a global digital nervous system, impossible to fully contain. The hypothetical custodians of the Genesis verity have been forced to adapt, evolving from mere archivists and suppressors into sophisticated players in the global information landscape. Their mission remains the same: to protect humanity from a destabilizing truth, but their methods have become a delicate and nuanced dance of engagement, misdirection, and controlled disclosure. This new strategy is not about saying nothing. It is about shaping the conversation. The Church can no longer ignore the questions raised by ancient astronaut theorists, genetic science, and planetary astronomy. Instead, it must engage with them on its own terms, steering the narrative towards safer, theologically compatible conclusions. This involves a multifaceted approach of calculated public statements, strategic funding, and the cultivation of allies within the scientific community. The most visible aspect of this dance is the Vatican's own foray into science. The Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world, is not merely a historical relic. With its advanced telescope at the Mount Graham International Observatory in Arizona, it is at the forefront of astronomical discovery. Publicly, its mission is to demonstrate that faith and science are not adversaries, but from the perspective of our narrative, it serves a dual purpose. It positions the Church as a friendly, authoritative voice on cosmic matters, and it provides an invaluable early warning system. The astronomers, perhaps unaware of the deeper secret they serve, are the custodian's eyes on the sky, monitoring the heavens for any sign of the anomalous, for any evidence that might corroborate the ancient fears. Similarly, the Vatican has become increasingly vocal on the topic of extraterrestrial life. High-ranking prelates and Vatican-approved scientists have made numerous public statements. The message is always carefully calibrated. The possibility of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe is exciting and does not contradict Catholic faith. In fact, it would be a testament to the infinite creativity of God. Monsignor Corrado Balducci, a theologian close to the Vatican, famously discussed extraterrestrials on Italian television, stating that their existence was likely and that they too would be part of God's creation. This is a masterstroke of narrative control. By embracing the concept of aliens, the Church appears open-minded and progressive, but by framing them as fellow children of God, it neutralizes their potential threat. They are placed firmly within the existing theological framework, created beings, not creators. This public stance is a preemptive defense against the Anunnaki hypothesis. If and when contact occurs, the Church can point to its long history of accepting the possibility. If the visitors are peaceful, the Church can welcome them as brothers. But if they arrive claiming to be our creators, the Church is already armed with a counter-narrative. You may have manipulated the clay, but you did not impart the soul. That was the work of God. They have already drawn the theological line in the sand. Behind the scenes, the dance is more direct. The custodians would actively monitor and, where possible, influence scientific research. This isn't the stuff of Hollywood conspiracy, with agents stealing hard drives. It is subtler. It involves funding grants for research into conventional human origins. It means promoting the work of archaeologists and geneticists, whose findings support the standard evolutionary model, and gently sidelining those who venture into more speculative territories. It involves having allies in peer review boards and academic journals, who can ensure that papers pushing the boundaries too far face an extra level of rigorous, perhaps insurmountable, scrutiny. Their greatest tool, however, remains the management of their own vast archive. The Vatican's secret archives are famously selective in what they release. Scholars must apply for access to specific documents, and the process is slow and restrictive. One can only imagine the criteria used to evaluate such requests. A query about medieval land disputes might be readily approved. A request to cross-reference certain papal correspondence with known dates of acquisitions from Mesopotamian digs might be lost or denied for vague reasons of preservation. The secret is protected not by a single locked door, but by a labyrinth of bureaucracy and procedure, ensuring that the most dangerous connections are never made by an outsider. This delicate dance is a perpetual high-wire act. On one side lies the abyss of exposure, which could lead to a catastrophic crisis of faith. On the other lies the danger of irrelevance. If the Church is seen as obstinately refusing to engage with modern science and cutting-edge discovery, the custodians must therefore walk a razor's edge. They must be just open enough to remain credible, but closed enough to protect their core secret. They must use the language of science to affirm faith, and the power of faith to circumscribe science. They are not at war with the modern world. They are attempting to choreograph it, to guide its steps, so that it never dances too close to the edge of the revelation they guard. Every public statement on aliens, every astronomical discovery published by the Vatican Observatory, every funded research grant is a move in this grand, global ballet performance designed to ensure the music of the old comforting story continues to play even as the whispers of a much older, terrifying song grow ever louder. The long vigil of the custodians, the delicate dance with modern science, the internal burden of the secret, all of it is predicated on a single, overarching belief that humanity is not ready. But a time may come when readiness is no longer a choice, but a consequence. This final chapter explores the ultimate horizon of our narrative, the moment of confrontation. It is a speculative glimpse into the potential futures that the Vatican's feared secret could unleash, and the final, terrible choice that may one day face both the Church and all of humankind. The trigger for this reckoning could come from any direction. It might not be the dramatic return of Nibiru or a fleet of alien ships filling the sky. It could be a quiet, academic paper in a prestigious journal, where a team of geneticists, using advanced algorithms to trace non-terrestrial phylogenetic markers, stumbles upon the undeniable signature of an artificial manipulation event in the human genome. It could be an astrophysicist analyzing data from the James Webb Space Telescope, confirming the existence and the composition of Planet X, and finding its atmosphere is not only habitable but shows signs of industrial particulates. The truth would not arrive with a declaration of war, but with a peer-reviewed publication. The world would change between breakfast and lunch. In that moment, the Vatican's centuries-long project of containment would evaporate. The secret would cease to be a secret and become the defining reality of human existence. The Church would stand at a precipice. Its first and most critical task would be to prevent a total vacuum of meaning. The carefully prepared theological reinterpretations, the Anunnaki as God's instruments. The soul as a divine impartation would be rushed from the drawing board into the pulpit. The Pope would be forced to deliver the most important address in history, a speech aimed at nothing less than reconciling 2,000 years of faith with a new, shocking origin story. His success or failure would determine whether the Church becomes an irrelevant relic or transforms into a vital guide through the greatest existential crisis our species has ever faced. But the Church's dilemma would be just a microcosm of humanity's. The revelation that we are the engineered product of another species would force a collective identity crisis of unimaginable scale. Every philosophy, every religion, every notion of purpose and destiny would be thrown into the air. The initial reactions would likely fracture the world. The nihilists, a significant portion of humanity, might succumb to despair and apathy. If our prayers were directed to entities who were merely our advanced technicians, if our soul is a philosophical construct, then life has no inherent meaning. This could lead to a widespread collapse of social and moral structures. The acclaimers, another faction, would likely embrace the Anunnaki as gods returned. New religions would spring up overnight, worshipping Enki or Enlil, seeking to please our creators in the hope of receiving favor, technology, or eternal life. This could lead to a dangerous, fanatical servitude. The rebels, a third group, would see this not as a homecoming, but as the ultimate enslavement. They would argue that humanity has evolved beyond its programming, that our culture, our art, our love, and our struggles define us more than our origins. They would prepare for a resistance against what they would view as cosmic colonialists returning to reclaim their property. The role of the Vatican, and of all institutions of faith, in this fractured world would be to fight for the human spirit. Their new mission would be to champion the idea that identity is not bestowed from the outside, but built from within. That meaning is not found in our origin, but in our choices. The most profound theological statement in this new age might be a simple, defiant declaration. We are more than what we were made to be. This leads to the final, terrifying choice. If the Anunnaki were to return, as the texts prophesy, humanity would be forced to decide, will we kneel, or will we stand? To kneel would be to accept a predetermined role in a cosmic hierarchy. It would be to trade the uncertain, often painful struggle for meaning for the security of a defined purpose, even if that purpose is servitude. It would be to end history as a human story and become a chapter in someone else's. To stand would be to claim ownership of ourselves, to declare that however we came to be, we are now our own. It would be to risk annihilation for the sake of autonomy. It would be the ultimate act of faith, not in a creator, but in the created. It would be to say that the spark of curiosity, compassion, and defiance that has driven us for millennia is worth more than any truth about our past. The Vatican's ancient fear of the Anunnaki was never about the beings themselves. It was about this moment of choice. They feared that humanity, presented with this ultimate test, would fail, that we would choose the comfortable lie of a predetermined purpose over the terrifying responsibility of forging our own. They feared we would kneel. The secret was kept, not out of arrogance, but out of a desperate love and a lack of faith not in God, but in us. They sought to protect us from the truth until we were strong enough, wise enough, and spiritually mature enough to hear it and still choose to stand. The great, tragic irony is that in shielding us, they may have prevented us from ever developing that very strength. The final reckoning will not be about the Anunnaki. It will be about whether humanity, faced with the obliteration of its founding myths, can find a reason to believe in itself. The silent guardians, in the end, were not protecting us from the truth. They were protecting the truth about us, that we are fragile, and the question remains whether that is the only truth there is.